And now we will dive right into the workshop. And I would like to introduce our main speaker today, who is our consultant for the study for this past year and the main author of the technical reports produced for the study. And I'll put the links for those reports in the chat in just a moment. He is with the consulting firm Arredondo, Zepeda and Bruns, LLC. Here is Mike Carlton.
Thank you, Elena. And again, I appreciate everyone participating in this meeting. Again, especially want to thank any elected officials that are participating. We've got a couple of city managers that are here as well. We expect a speaker from outside the region to talk to us a little bit later on some of the landfill issues. So I appreciate everybody being here. And as the poll indicated, most of you aren't new to this project, and appreciate you staying with us and assisting us in putting together the reports. We are still open to taking any comments that you might have on those. We'll be presenting them to the COGS RCC in the August meeting, but we definitely want to keep this moving, and that's what a lot of today's discussion is going to be about. Is while the study's complete, there's still a lot of work to do, and the focus now needs to move from planning, studying to actually implementation. This is a workshop. I really wish this were in person. It works much better in that format, but we're dealing with the times that we're in. What I'm hoping to have happen out of today's agenda is a lot of discussion from the participants about where this effort can go and how we best accomplish the goals that we started out with, are to ensure disposal capacity, as well as identify some opportunities for local governments to work together to, enhance the environment and make programs more efficient. So we'll walk through some examples of how that can happen. And again, looking for a lot of discussion, questions. We've got some polls that kind of gauge where people are, as Elena mentioned. So your participation in those is going to also be helpful. As Elena said, this is a COG study. I do want to thank Cassie, Tamara, and Elena for all their help over the past year in working with them and putting the study together. It's been a very collaborative effort. And I also want to thank Rachel Herring with Keep Texas Recycling for providing some valuable input into the study. And I know that her programs have the potential of helping with the implementation, especially on the recycling side, and how to incorporate what she's doing with some of the things that, especially some of the counties in the rural area, want to incorporate into their future solid waste program. So again, I want to thank everybody for their assistance throughout this. And I want to thank the members of the Policy Advisory Group who have stuck with this, provided some good input, and assisting us in completing this effort. So just a little recap on some of the background associated with this. I think I went back, and this is almost 4 years that, AZB and I presented something to the COG, which identified some issues as it related to capacity in the western part of the COG region. We had several meetings ultimately leading to this study, and definitely don't want to see it stop here. We want to see it continue. But Elena, why don't you go to the next slide, please? The three main issues that we've identified, again, is the region is running out of disposal capacity, recognizing that it takes somewhere between 10 to 15 years to go from we're going to do this to ultimately having a site identified, permitted, and constructed. So that lead times on this are pretty extensive. In addition to the capacity issue, as I mentioned, there's opportunities to improve the region's environment and also to do things cooperatively to make programs more efficient. Again, as Elena mentioned, this is an 8-county project, 34 cities with populations over 5,000. The area covers 7,000 square miles and has a population of 2.65 million people. So given that that background, there is a significant amount of waste that's being generated every year, and it is having an impact on that capacity. We expect that from a conservative standpoint, that waste generation will continue at that pace, especially with the growth that's anticipated over the next 10 to 20 years in terms of both population and economic activity. We looked at projected waste quantities, and we also looked at it in terms of what might be reduced. The assumption in terms of waste reductions through recycling programs, waste reduction efforts. Again, we tend to take a conservative outlook on this simply because you want to make sure that capacity is available. Right now, the capacity in the region is about 60 million tons. And in order to meet the needs through 2050, the region's going to need an additional 57 million tons of capacity, because at some point around 2035, 2038, that's when the existing capacity is going to get utilized. So we did a needs assessment, which looked at capacity, looked at how much waste is anticipated to be generated. It also looked at the overall infrastructure in terms of recycling facilities, other transfer stations, citizen convenience stations. Those are all identified in the needs assessment. Based on that assessment, we also did a survey of local governments to identify what their interests are, what they have planned to build in the future. And from that, we came up with 10 recommended alternatives. And during our last meeting, we walked through each one of those recommendations. And based on some input from the group back then, what they wanted to hear about next were the 4 topics that we'll be talking about today, which are, establish an ongoing policy advisory group and explore the potential of a regional solid waste management agency, increase citizen collection station availability, increase composting capacity, and finally, increasing landfill capacity. And so we'll have a discussion this morning about some of the options there. Again, I'll be looking for input from the group in terms of how best to make this happen. We want to, again, move from study planning to actually implementing the recommendations in this report. So the first thing we want to talk about, policy advisory group. And, again, several years ago, we got together with COG before this study and talked about getting a group of local government officials together that represent the cities and counties in this region, started having meetings to talk about the issues, some of the options, both technically and organizationally. And that policy, that group basically got formalized to some degree for this study, and it's the Policy Advisory Group. And so far, its purpose has been to provide input into the study and to kind of guide us through some of the recommendations, provide feedback into what we put together. What we'll be talking about this morning is, what's the next step for that group? Next slide, please, Lena. So we recommend that this group continue to function. And some of the activities that we anticipate would be implement regional public information programs, implement a regional communications program, which is really designed to allow local governments to network within the region about what they're planning on doing, where they see opportunities to share and work on different types of projects, which addresses that third bullet. Establish a regional training program. We talk about having meetings on a regular basis, having somebody come in and speak about a specific topic to provide that continuing education aspect of what the PAG can do. And finally, it's to evaluate the potential of a regional solid waste management agency. And this would be a local government corporation that can take on actually developing projects, implementing them, funding them, taking on the permitting responsibilities. And we'll talk about some of those options a little bit later when we talk about landfill side of things. But as the PAG is concerned, it can lay the groundwork for actually getting that agency started. So there are some networking opportunities as well as working on developing a new agency that can take on the responsibilities that will be required to meet future capacity needs. What we've laid out in terms of recommendations is, in terms of the next steps for the policy advisory group, would be to provide any comments on the reports. We've gotten some in the past on the needs assessment side of things. And then this is something that we wanted to talk about this morning, is formalizing that group. And one of the benefits of formalizing it is, as a separate entity, it may be able to go after grants that would be for the use of the entire region, such as the public information type of program. Without that formal structure, I think it would be very difficult for the PAG to do that. It also is anticipated that as you formulate an agency, ultimately you're going to have to vote on some things, and you want to identify who's actually going to have voting privileges. Are they a member of the PAG? But it also, so we're looking at possibly formalizing that. It doesn't have to be the first thing that happens out of the box, but I think it's something that I would recommend looking at. And then ultimately establish a meeting schedule, identify some near-term regional opportunities, and then evaluate the agency, and also identifying some training opportunities. The bylaws, again, this is something that I'm interested to hear comments from the group as to, does it make sense to formalize this? Does it make sense to continue on as a kind of a volunteer group? And one of the things that we want to talk about most here this morning on the policy advisory group is, what do you think the goals of that policy advisory group should be? We talk about bylaws, we're talking about establishing the purpose of that group, who's a member, what the leadership looks like, what its responsibilities are, and potential funding sources. There's a group that is called the Best Southwest Partnership, and it's a group of cities: Lancaster, DeSoto, Cedar Hill, and Lancaster are their main participants. But they have an organization that is primarily designed for economic development in that area. But they have a structure, they have fees that are charged, they conduct periodic training, and they'll also do economic activities. That may be a model for a policy advisory group once it gets structured. And I think at a future meeting, it would be useful to have somebody from that group come and talk about how they got set up and what their purpose is. But I think from a more immediate standpoint, based on what we've done over the past year, what would you say are the top goals for the policy advisory group right now?
Right. Okay. So some of the things that we talked about in our discussion were, having action items for a group. If the group is just coming together to talk again and to learn, more information that's interesting, that's helpful. But it's also very valuable for a group to have, this group has some pretty clearly defined long-term goals. It's also helpful, though, for a group like this to have some short-term goals. So in the near term, what would this group like to accomplish? And if we can define that, the Council of Governments, I believe, can help with some of those short-term goals and making our way down a path towards the long-term goal. But I think, as Elena mentioned, the goals of this study is really to identify the needs, the capacity needs of this area, and then also to come up with a menu of alternatives to address those needs. So that's a clear definition of the long-term goals for this group. That's what we're trying to accomplish. We've identified that there's a problem. So big step. Okay, we know. I think many of you already knew that, but, you know, beyond identifying that there's a problem and talking about alternatives, you know, what could this group take action on in the very near future? Let's just say over the next year, you know, are there short-term goals that we can help this group with that you collectively could define, so that we're making progress, so that we're not, you know, continuing down a path. It's great to get people together. It's important to network. It's important to share stories. It's important to share problems and to identify common needs. But all of that kind of gets housed into the notion of short-term goals. And so, you know, bylaws are fantastic and help you define how to move down a path and kind of the rules of engagement. But I think having those short-term goals is a necessary component to successfully getting the results from that structure that you might define. And so that's really my request of the group today is, you know, have any short-term goals been established through these discussions? Do we have anything that collectively we can help, you know, to make some progress on? So that would be something that I would like to hear from this group. I noticed we kind of buried Dustin's question. He posted in the chat, and then we posted some things about a web page. But you know, one of his comments here is there any idea as to how many existing landfills have ability to expand to help meet the 57 tons needed? That's a great question. You know, there's a lot of alternatives being proposed, and I think, you know, Mike's probably in the best position to respond to that question. But we do want to help, and we don't want to just keep bringing the group together for the purpose of getting together. I think that's necessary in order to make progress, but it's also helpful if we leave a meeting with action items, not just COG action items, but group action items. So I'd like to get your input today on that, if that's possible, you know, from those that we have present today. So thank you, Mike, for the opportunity to chime in.
Thanks, Edith. Elena, you've got some polling questions. You want to run through those, and then we can kind of talk about what the results are as it relates to this?
Sure, we can do that. Would either you or a representative attend meetings of the Western Region Policy Advisory Group after this workshop? 90% yes. And we'll move on to another question here. What concerns do you have, if any, about continuing meetings of the Western Region Policy Advisory Group after this workshop? A meaningful group, I saw in there as well. Progress is turning into a common answer. Progress, participation, assignments. And we will go ahead and move on to the next. I think there's a couple more. Do you see value in establishing the Western Region Solid Waste Management Agency? Okay, 69% say yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you for answering that. That helps us gauge what you're thinking. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to another question. This question is, what do you think is the immediate next step for the Western Region Policy Advisory Group? Establishing the committee is rising to the top. We see the need. We need focus. Framework for action. Establish a meeting schedule. Capacity. Okay, we're getting some thumbs up here. Establishing the committee is now rising to the top. We see the need, but we need focus. Okay. Entity buy-in on the direction. Okay. We need focus is again rising to the top. It's in a war though with entity buy-in. I'll scroll down a bit so you can see what else is on there. Getting engagement from the Western governments, not just the Eastern governments. Framework for continued action, education, establishing the committee. Okay, go back to the top here. So you can see the top, we need the focus. Let me refresh. Identifying opportunities for increasing capacity, new landfills. That has 6 thumbs up. And when the slides are posted on the webpage, I'll put the results of the polls in there as well. We'll take a break here for a discussion. Mike, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, want to go back to the discussion on and some of the polling that was done on both on a policy advisory group, and I'd like to hear from some of the folks as it relates to those that identified need focus and where that focus should be directed in terms of future meetings. And I know that the next 2 were identify or entity buy-in and identifying new capacity. The response on the creation of an agency looked like it was about 60-40 of yes and maybe, and I would say that a lot of that maybe is not knowing what that agency responsibilities are going to be or what the city's responsibilities are to it. And all that ties in with, how do you get that new capacity? But I'd like to hear from folks, especially on that need focus, both in terms of what you want that focus to be and how does the policy advisory group accomplish that? Because as I mentioned, we're moving into the implementation phase of this. What are your thoughts in terms of how do we gain that focus? What information do you need in terms of getting that entity created and getting more buy-in to it? I'd really like to hear from folks that responded and what your thoughts are. Dustin, how do you see the policy advisory group moving forward? I'm just going to start picking on people.
I'm glad you pick on me first here. I think my comment wasn't necessarily directed to focus, but some of my questions is I'm looking at a list of the attendees here, and I recognize a lot of you guys and ladies, and a big majority of the list of people that are interested in this, and justly so, are geographically located not necessarily what I would consider the Western region. And I think we're having a lot of the issues and everything seems to kind of focus with really out here in the Western region and not having that buy-in or not having the attendance or not being aware of what's going on. And obviously our issues out here are going to affect the entire COG region. So, really when it comes to the policy advisory group, I mean, I think that, focus and where we're going and how we want to set that up and what the goals are important. But I think one of the most important next steps is, how do we get buy-in? How do we get these other partners locally to realize the problem and come to the table and be a part of the solution? And I don't know if it's a policy advisory group. I don't know that it isn't. I see benefits whenever it comes to being able to apply for grants and have a little bit more of like a unified front, or is it something more of sitting around and educational opportunities to talk and educate some of the groups out here, some of my fellow cities and colleague cities, and to get there? I don't know what the best option is, but I know that we've got to have more participation from some of the Western entities. Did I ramble too much there?
No, that's fine. And Howard, I know that you've been participating in this effort throughout. What are your thoughts on the next steps as it relates to implementation of this? Howard's on or not?
Yeah, Just to kind of follow up on what Dustin was saying there, I don't know, smaller communities out in the West and stuff, their participation would certainly be helpful, and we would appreciate it. To me, more than anything, though, what we need is the county leadership. Because if we're going to get into a point eventually where we're going to be trying to site a new landfill with a group or agency, the one thing we don't want to have happen is now all of a sudden the county commissioners start, throwing up red roadblocks as well. So that's something, we've had some participation with Stephenville. I think Cleburne has sent out some representatives to some of the meetings and stuff. Clearly Dustin's been involved pretty heavily all along, but we've never had consistent engagement with anybody at a county level. If we're able to formalize a policy advisory group, create bylaws where we have specific representatives, kind of like we do with the RCC, we have a couple of members that are supposed to be from the county, a couple from the private sector, large cities, small cities, that kind of mix. So that at least, while the meetings would be open for anybody that wants to participate, the decision making and stuff is still somewhat representative of the overall region. And I don't have any insight or anything on who to even contact at any of these counties that would have an interest. I just see it as being kind of a critical path down the road, that we need to explore a little bit more.
At the COG level, are in other committees and stuff like that. I mean, are there some committees where you do have like the judges and so forth attending, or is it kind of like it is kind of sparse with attendance?
So I'll jump in on that one, Dustin. Thanks for the question. We have several specifically policy groups that fall under the Open Meetings Act. That's going to be our executive board made up of judges, commissioners, mayors, council folks. And then we have our workforce board, which is made up of political figures, as well as we have a new 911 district. So that's an additional group of policy makers that come together. And then of course our transportation, regional transportation council is another policy group. So those are really, big picture focused groups that guide an activity or a number of regional activities. But we have, more than that, we have, groups that are advisory groups, essentially, folks that are in the weeds on the topic, that carry a topic forward, make a recommendation to the COG executive board, and we carry those items forward. So, there are smaller, like with our floodplain groups, we have a flood management task force, which is made up of a lot of floodplain administrators throughout the Trinity River corridor. But then once a year, they present a recommendation to a steering committee, which is elected officials that come together, and basically they're getting an update on what's been happening, what progress we've made, and approving the next year's work plan. So that's a long answer to a short question, but hopefully that gives you a better feel for the quantity. For example, in environment development, we have 10 primary committees, 20 advisory groups or subcommittees to those primary committees. But of all of those, we really just have the one that's the elected officials that come together on an annual basis.
Well, and Howard's point is very, very right. I mean, and I'm sure there's more than just, landfill capacity that this group could approach and talk about if we did formally establish something. But that being a big one, I mean, you would want county officials involved. I'm just yeah, I haven't seen a whole lot of, I guess I haven't seen a whole lot of attendance with some of our issues as of late from the different county judges or commissioners. There's been a few, and maybe some are here today that would like to speak up on that. But I mean, as far as getting them together, I mean, would it help if we turned around and like, I mean, I don't mind even hosting or buying lunch and specifically inviting, spend some time to try to invite some of these other county commissioners together to explain some of the problems we're doing. But I mean, I don't know that that's the first issue that we approach. I don't know. I guess jumping off and getting started is where I'm kind of at.
It's Brian Burner with City of Denton, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think first of all, there's an awareness issue. I mean, for those of us who are interested, we're on this meeting. But, when you look out west, how aware, I mean, they know they've got that their garbage prices are rising with their contractors, but I'm not sure they're thinking much further than that. What we may have to do is do just a little road show, and within each county, invite the county judge, county commissioners, and the mayors of the city. And like you said, maybe host a lunch and learn or something and roll this out. And if you get commitment from 2 or 3 counties, and county judges and that infrastructure, I think that becomes the basis of your planning group, and then everybody else will jump on board. Because again, I think we had talked if you look at one of the earlier polls, it was the equitability of the issue. You don't want one county or one city carrying the load for everybody else. It's got to be a group effort.
Based on the feedback, that there definitely seems like there's an interest in continuing this. To formalize the policy advisory group, I think is a step that you want to take. I would suggest that we work with the COG and set up the next meeting, and those meetings, as some of the respondents were talking about, needs focus. And so as we move towards implementation, that's something that we'll want to be very clear that this meeting is about this issue and our outcomes are anticipated to be X. The discussion may be on organics, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And we'll look at the outcome being where are some opportunities for some cooperative projects. In terms of establishing the entity, that is something that's going to be ongoing, and I think it's going to take a lot of discussion because it is going to be somewhat complex to get every local government both to understand the need for it and what its role is. So I think that that's an ongoing issue that needs to be talked about. We've identified an outline in the report of what the responsibilities and so forth are. And I've got Brian Griesbach has joined us, and when we get to the landfill section, he'll talk a little bit about the VISMA and where that can go. But is there generally agreement about having another meeting and then starting to set an agenda that looks at specific topics, both discuss and come up with specific action its on? Is that what I'm hearing from the group in terms of where it wants to go?
I mean, Mike,
Sure.
Weatherford, I mean, definitely has an interest in continuing these conversations. And I think I'll speak for myself and volunteer Weatherford. I think we're willing to put forth a little bit more of the work to try to help get this established. But I mean, we definitely need some guidance, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And I think, and I don't know if there's so many different things that we eventually need to tackle, like what Edith was talking about earlier, or if we just need like some short-term goals or a goal to start this group or this process and start building those connections and getting them involved from that and kind of going from there. But Weatherford's willing to participate, however, but we don't want to do it completely alone.
Right. I'll be willing to just kind of work with the group and help identify those priorities and make some recommendations. One of the issues that came up at the last meeting, in terms of focus was increasing organics management capacity in the region. This project or this issue kind of illustrates, how this group can work. Dustin's been talking a little bit about what's been going on, but as we've been doing this study, Weatherford's been looking at an organics management facility. The city at one point owned its own landfill. The city sold that facility, and the city Weatherford's landfill was used for disposing of biosolids, not just for the city of Weatherford, but also several cities around the western region rely on that facility for biosolids disposal as well. Dustin, that landfill is what now got a couple of months of capacity, as I understand it, getting down there.
Yeah, I've been told, I mean,
And,
it's,
do you mind talking? Yeah. Do you mind briefly talking about your project and, what you're planning on doing?
yeah, so I mean, we've been not formally told yet, but I mean, we've essentially been told that we've got less than a year before the landfill is probably going to close, and biosolids considerably less than that because they need to stop accepting biosolids. They don't want that at the top. I don't really understand why, but so that's an issue in itself. So essentially, what we're faced with is we were taking about 6,000, give or take, tons of biosolids from our water treatment plant facility to the landfill that now cannot go to the landfill. And we have built a transfer station, or actually the Waste Connections built a transfer station there, but they're not going to be able to accept biosolids. So now our biosolids that we produce are going to end up going all the way to another landfill, which is likely going to be either probably Turkey Creek landfill, which we have some contractual agreements that they've got to take it. And but regardless, we're now going about 50 plus miles to dispose of this. And it's extremely costly. We're having to change. We're going to end up having to buy new equipment to haul it. So then we ended up conducting and looking at, well, what are our options with biosolids? So obviously we can continue to take it to a landfill. We can turn around and look at doing something else like land applying, or we can look at composting. We do currently have a brush collection route where we divert brush that's been from going to the landfill, and we take that and we turn around and mulch it or grind it down into kind of mulch, and then we pay for that to be hauled off. But now we're looking at taking, well, essentially the study that we did has really indicated that a composting operation could be the most significant cost reduction method for us of the three that we really looked at, with landfill or land apply or composting. City of Weatherford itself, although we've got 6,000 tons or so, it's right there. I mean, we're able to do it where it looks like it makes economic sense for us, but we're on the small scale of that. Now, there was suggestions that if we look at regionalizing this, there's an economy of scales that as we take in more material and maybe from other entities and so forth, that we end up getting bigger equipment. It's a more efficiently ran operation, and that the economics of it are considerably better. So we've applied now for grant funding from the and waiting and hoping that we're able to get some funding that would be able to be applied to do a study essentially that would say, do we want to regionalize this? Do we want to bring in other partners? Now, I've preliminarily talked to cities and some different cities in really about 5 different counties, and there's quite a bit of preliminary interest in. One, they didn't know the landfill in Weatherford was closing. They haven't even thought about what they're going to do with their biosolids whenever it closes, and that's not all, but some. And then if there was a more regionalized composting operation where they could dispose of their biosolids and or clean brush material, that they were interested in working together. So versus them in turn having to haul a considerable distance, really even most of them even further than what Weatherford's going to have to do. So it's a pretty unique opportunity. It's a lot of risk that if we decide to regionalize this, that Weatherford will be taking on. So that's what we're trying to mitigate now with a kind of a technical study and feasibility assessment and everything. But that's kind of the plan. And I think it's really been a direct result of some of what we've been working with here in the Western region and kind of opportunities that have presented itself.
Thanks, Dustin. As Dustin mentioned, to make that project work, there was a number of elements that, they're going to have to evaluate, in terms of, the supply of materials, biosolids, organic material, and got a slide on what that all could include. But not just the supply of materials, but the market for the product, having an acceptable site, going through the permitting process and making the investment in equipment and labor, coming up with a financing method for doing that, and then also having the political will to move that project forward, because there are, as Dustin mentioned, certain risks that they'll have to take into consideration as they move this. And again, this could represent a pretty significant amount of material that gets pulled out of landfills. It's probably one of the more promising ways to reduce waste in the region. Already, we know that about 74,000 tons of biosolids are landfilled throughout the region. And I know how much landfills hate to see that material in their facility. So there's an opportunity there to do something and do something collectively. Let's go to the next slide. And this is what Dustin was talking about. We had conversations, at the beginning of the study where we talked about, Weatherford being interested in a compost facility. When we did the local government survey, cities that responded that they were interested in doing something from a composting standpoint were not just Weatherford, but Brian Denton had responded, yes, I know that you've got a facility already up there. Grapevine, New Fairview, North Richland Hills are looking at this as a possibility as well. But what Dustin was talking about is, as we move forward through the study, it became clear that other cities have got somewhat of the same issue. And this is kind of a model for a lot of other projects, whether it's citizen convenience stations, transfer stations. It's looking at, your needs, but also communicating with some of the surrounding cities, in terms of, does this project interest you? Do you see value in participating in it? And in doing so, making the project more cost effective. And that's where I see one of the benefits of having the policy advisory group continue to meet is, you talk about a specific project and use that network to possibly make them broader in terms of participation. And this is somewhat the implementation timeframe that be looking at for that project. So again, it is a long-term process, 3 years. It's definitely shorter than a landfill, but it is a long-term commitment. Look forward to this possibly being one of those regional projects that gets kicked off. So again, when we start talking about interlocal agreements, these are some of the issues that the cities are going to have to negotiate once it's determined that there is interest, and that would be you're committing to that project, and that this is a long-term commitment, not just a year-by-year commitment by the participating cities, whether it's to supply materials or for Weatherford on a long-term basis to commit to processing that. And then it's a matter of working out the fee structures, whether or not there's revenue sharing, risk sharing. There are a number of risks in terms of construction, operation, and whether or not those risks are shared between the participants. And anytime you get a contract put together, you're going to have lawyers talking about indemnification. But those are some of the key components, and it doesn't just apply to the composting type of projects. This would be any kind of shared project that being considered. So again, you know, when we look at the policy advisory group, these are some roles that it could apply to a compost project, but you could substitute citizen convenience stations or transfer stations. Training for cities, coming in and having folks talk about what's involved, what's required for these projects, talk about feasibility issues. Again, coordinating potential project participants, and then potentially bringing in private sector participants who may be ad hoc members of the PAG that could have a role in developing any of these projects. So, and again, Elena, you've got these are some issues that, you know, I'd like to have some conversation about, but I know that Elena's got some poll slides. Why don't you go ahead with those?
Do you think there is value in exploring how local governments in the Western region can participate in a regional compost program? Okay, 85% yes, 15% maybe. There is. What roadblocks do you think are hindering the development of a regional compost program for the Western region? Cost and marketing, ability to move product, uncertainty, lack of finances, cost and marketing. Thank you for your patience as I refresh my screen. Buy-in and cooperation, broader participation in the study, communication and structure, location, haul distance, startup costs is in big letters, so that's a common answer. Uncertainty. I'll refresh one more time in case you're thinking of more responses you want to throw in there. Uncertainty, the unknown of abilities that are actually available for the project. Okay. Broader participation in study, engagement, startup costs, cost and marketing, ability to move product is a big one. Really big font. Cost and marketing, ability to move product, marketing, buy-in, funding, communication, location, haul distance. Thank you everyone for your answers. All right, what information do you think we need about organics management in the Western region that we currently do not have? Volume, availability, potential feedstock again, waste digestion, product, but you can see markets and feedstock are the main answers there from the group, because the information that we need that we don't have. All right, do you want to go back to the discussion slide from the polls then?
Sure. I know Dustin's talked about this project. I'd be interested to hear, from one or a couple of the cities that is interested in participating in the project, what your thoughts are on the benefits of it, and what your potential concerns are in working on a cooperative project. I know we've got some of those cities represented here. I just would like to hear, from a participant, not just Dustin in this effort.
I mean, I think some of the two main concerns, that we have, and we've done a little bit of research on this as well, but feedstock and marketing, I think those are two things that are really important to make sure we understand before we or anybody jumps off into this.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll have some conversation about what really brought this whole thing about, and that is landfill capacity and what some of our next steps might be in terms of making sure that there's future capacity in the region. As I mentioned, it's the capacity issue that is driving all of this. And when we're looking at regionally having somewhere between 15 and 20 years of capacity, City of Arlington is pretty well set in terms of its current capacity as well as the potential to expand their capacity, recognizing that that's on the extreme eastern part of the western region. But the other landfills that are accepting a lot of type 1 waste, municipal solid waste, include the City of Fort Worth landfill, Turkey Creek landfill. As I mentioned, Weatherford actually has much less than 1.5 years. This data was when we first started this study. And then the City of Cleburne is accepting a small amount of waste every year for their own needs. So it's really this issue that's driving it. And we look at, what capacities are available in terms of years. And Turkey Creek, even with their expansion, and the anticipated increase in waste volumes, because as Weatherford closes, that waste is going to end up, a lot of that waste is going to end up at that facility, which is going to shorten its lifespan. City of Fort Worth, somewhere around 15 to 20 years of capacity, depending on how much growth there is in the region. And again, the City of Arlington, looking fairly good in terms of its capacity from a long-term basis. Next slide. And understand, as when I say dominoes falling, it's when one landfill closes, that waste has got to go someplace else, which is going to accelerate the time frame when that facility reaches its capacity. This shows the current situation, and these numbers represent tons per year that are taken to those facilities. And again, these represent the landfills that are accepting the majority of municipal solid waste in the region. And if you look back at the chart that we just showed in terms of timeframes, go ahead to the next slide. If nothing happens in the next 20 years, then you're looking at a situation where the Arlington landfill is the only one that's operational and has capacity. And this is, not necessarily what's going to happen in terms of them accepting the entire waste stream. Some of that probably is going to go outside the region. But, you're looking at about 2.5 million tons per year having to go to potentially one facility at 6,700 tons per day. And just to give you some reference point, McComas landfill exceeds about 4,500 tons per day. Again, this isn't necessarily, what will happen depending on waste flows and so forth, but the map does indicate, that if we don't do anything in 20 years, there's just not a landfill to serve a very growing population and a lot of economic activity. There's a couple of principles associated with landfill site selection, design, and operation. One is nobody wants one in their city, county, or region. I haven't participated in a site selection project where somebody said, yeah, please put it here. But recognizing that unless something changes dramatically in terms of technology, some of those are evolving, but given that reliability is a key factor, we really can't, at this point in time, say that we don't need a landfill because there's going to be a solution that will take care of this problem short of that. And the third point is that the region must have a reliable waste management system. And so that's what's driving this. And we've talked about one of the solutions being an agency being created to help manage the system. And in the past, I've had a chance to work with the Brazos Valley Solid Waste Management Agency. When it first started, we used to joke about the fact that it was a interlocal agreement between College Station and the city of Bryan, and it was called an agency. However, we considered it basically a functioning non-entity. because it was really an interlocal agreement that the cities would participate in solid waste management. Since then, it is a functioning agency. It is a local government corporation. And I've invited Brian Griesbach to talk to the group. Brian is from Bavisma. He's the executive director, responsible for the operation of that facility, which serves not just College Station and Bryan, but several of the surrounding counties. And Brian, would you mind talking a little bit about your organization, how you're structured, how it began, how you're funded?
Sure, Mike. Thanks for having me. Can you all hear me okay?
And I do appreciate you taking the time out to speak to the group.
No problem. As Mike mentioned, Bavisma Inc. was started in 2010 as a result of some problems that were occurring between the two cities at the time. One of which was the landfill capacity at the Rock Prairie Road landfill was diminishing, and they needed an alternative. And to make that alternative happen, they realized that it would be better off if both cities participated equally, thus the formation of an agency, Bavisma Inc., which is a local nonprofit government corporation. So nonprofit, key word there. We're formed through the Texas Transportation Codes, which I think Mike has addressed in other presentations. There's several others in the state of Texas. One other that I know of is TASWA, which operates a landfill. The newest one, I believe, is a entity that was formed up in Farmers Branch in Louisville to run their 911 call center. So different agencies using the same structure. In this case, we run a landfill, the Twin Oaks landfill, a compost facility, which is Twin Oaks Compost, which is at a closed site in Bryan, which really is a sludge disposal facility, as you guys have discussed. We also provide twice a year household hazardous waste collection services. That's open not just for the two cities, but for the entire COG region that we're in. And then we manage the closed Rock Prairie Road landfill. Mike mentioned that nobody wants a landfill, but nobody wants a landfill before they have a landfill. Once they have a landfill, counties actually like having landfills. In this case, we pay Grimes County a pretty healthy host fee. So in effect, Grimes County figured out a way to get Brazos County residents to pay tax in Grimes County. Grimes County definitely enjoys that tax that they get through a host fee. Mike, you want me to go into more detail on the entity side?
A little bit on the entity side, and you've got a board that manage or oversees your operations, and also a little bit how you're funded.
Sure. We're self-funded through user fees. So the two cities, Bryan and College Station, initially each put up $5 million. We pay that $5 million back over 20 years with interest, both of the two cities. In addition, since we're nonprofit, any, call it excess revenue we generate goes back to the cities in the form of a reduced tipping fee. That tipping fee, since we started in 2011 at Twin Oaks, was $21.50 a ton. Next year, the two cities will pay $13 a ton for disposal. So that's kind of their benefit of ownership, if you will. From an operations side, it's a really nice way to run a landfill. My primary goal, if you will, is to serve my owners, the City of Bryan, College Station, and what they want most is a reliable landfill that they can easily get in and out of with their trucks. If I were a large landfill operator, one of the big public companies, my primary goal would be to make my budget this month. So with that in mind, I probably have one of the nicest landfills in the state of Texas in terms of access roads, scale house facility, operating equipment, because we're all self-funded, We rotate through our operating equipment on a very predictable scale because we want predictable costs. We don't necessarily want the lowest cost, we want predictable costs. We're governed by a board of 7 people. 3 of the members are from City of Bryan. 3 of the members are nominated by City College Station. And then our 7th member is voted on by the board, which is just somebody from the community at large. That's worked out very well for us because our board has really put aside politics when they come to the Bavizma board meeting and really try to focus on what's the best thing for the agency. But from the agency side, we do take a great deal of care to make sure that we are as, I guess you'd say, non-partisan as possible, that everything we do is fair and equal to both cities. We don't take on projects that might benefit one city over the other.
Brian,
in here.
you mentioned, what percentage of your annual revenues would you say are coming from College Station and Bryan in terms of tipping fees versus revenues that are generated from, call it non-participant?
Next, it declines as the College Station and as the city internal rate drops. The percentage revenue they bring in also drops. Next
Right.
year, the 2 cities will probably represent somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of our revenue.
So 80% of your revenue is generated from
Third
waste
party,
that's
right.
coming from outside of College Station and Bryan. Is that correct?
Right. The City Bryan, City College Station do their own residential collection. So outside haulers are providing that commercial collection.
Okay.
The commercial rate for third parties is $28 a ton, which is still one of the lowest rates in the state that I'm aware of for general tipping fees. Again, that's developed by the board. We want a balance of a tipping fee that won't be too low and kind of sells our airspace out too inexpensive, and thus we bring in a lot of people from outside the region. But we don't want it so high that it's a burden on the businesses in Bryan and College Station because they are kind of the closest, nearest center for the waste that comes to us.
Okay.
Right now, we're about 1,500 tons a day typical for our landfill right now, which is a good size. For running a landfill, you start getting any bigger than that, and you're going to get a lot more traffic, a lot more issues with truck traffic on the roads, other things that go with big sites. Other things I would mention, you talked about your name. We quickly dropped Bavizma Inc. because nobody knew what that was. So we learned really quick that you call somebody up and say, I'm from Bavizma. They say, what? So we dropped that and we added a doing business as Twin Oaks Landfill. We came up with a different logo, so it's more of a corporate presentation, and that was kind of, I guess, some of the critical areas, if you want. Financial transparency is probably the key to the agency being in existence. That's the quickest way for me to lose my job, is if we can't account for all the revenue and can't document all the spending. So when we structured how we came to be, putting in those separation of duties so that no one person has control over the lifespan of any transaction, whether it's a scale ticket to billing and accounting and receiving, or on the other end, on the bill paying procedures. We've had other checks and balances put in place. So you have different people writing the checks, then approve the payment. And we do that with the use of an outside third-party accounting firm. So, for example, we send out the billing from our office, but they receive it as a lockbox at a bank. So that the person that generated the bill is completely different than the person that credits the account. Those are just a lot of little details that need to be accounted for when you set up a new entity. In addition, you're going to have to, kind of create your bylaws and your operations agreement so that everybody knows up front what the agency is going to do, define that, what's going to be reported, how often, kind of a corporate identity, as I mentioned, a mission statement, who's your customer base, who are you serving? And of course, you're going to have your initial landfill construction. That's a challenging time because you have to spend a lot of money right up front to develop all your roads and infrastructure. Once you get going, it's not as bad because after that, you're just developing one landfill cell at a time. So that decreases over time. Your initial staffing is going to be an issue. You're going to have to come up with your human resources. And for us, again, we're a small agency, but we're independent from the cities. So we rely on a third-party human resources entity to help us with if we have particular HR issues we want to ask an expert. They're available at a phone call. You have to establish all your policies, whether it's how you handle your accounts receivable, how you handle the scale house cash, all of those things, your policies for your employees. Again, your HR can help with that. Employee handbook is a big one. And then what we learned at startup, one of the more difficult things is nobody knows who you are when you start. They're going to say, okay, you're an agency. Congratulations, ready to go. You try to go buy fuel somewhere and you don't have any credit history. That becomes a pretty big hurdle at the first couple of years. Well, you try to work with different vendors and build your credit history from the start. So I think if anything, that was something that we lacked and we could have done better somehow, some way, and made that a smoother transition. Instead, what we really had to do up front, we relied a lot on credit cards, which are more difficult to manage from a financial standpoint to make sure they don't get misused. But if you don't have an account with Napa and you need a filter, somebody's got to go pick it up. So that's where we started. But over the time, we now have accounts with all of our vendors and really don't rely on that credit card use at all. I think the other issue you're going to need to tackle from a wider perspective or viewpoint is once you build this landfill and put up all the capital, you're going to want to ensure that the waste shows up at your gate. So you're going to have to put in some form of flow control from the different agencies that are participating. So there's numbers of ways to do that. For Bryan and College Station, because they do collect their own, but then any franchise agreement for any hauler coming from Bryan or College Station, they require those haulers to transport the waste to the Twin Oaks landfill. So that's their form of flow control to assure that, okay, we put up a lot of money and made this happen. It was difficult, but now they wanted to make sure there was at least a minimum amount of waste that actually went to the gate so that the agency could be independent and self-funding. Lots of questions, I'm sure, rattling through everybody's heads, and I'm kind of an overview for you.
I appreciate it. I'd like to open it up for questions for Bryan. I appreciate him taking the time. I know that this has been something that we've talked about in the past year, and you've got somebody, here in the meeting that is actually doing it. So if you've got some questions for Bryan, I'd appreciate any questions right now for him. Bryan, about how long did it take from, when you took over, if I remember correctly, it was still an agency, which was an interlocal agreement. So you already had a foundation set up, but, to actually go through the process of becoming incorporated, do you remember how long that took?
That really didn't take long at all.
Okay.
They file the paperwork and you're a corporation, you're born. But the bad news comes then when the city says you're on your own. That, like I said, then you realize you need to go buy the first load of diesel fuel, and the the place that always provided you diesel fuel before says, how are you going to pay us?
Right.
And so, well, we'll set up an account. They say, you have zero credit history. You've never paid anybody anything. How do I know you're going to pay us? Right. So
Yep.
there's a lot of negotiation and some trust on behalf of the vendors, and but that, you know,
Did,
when it comes to the first day, there's some little hiccups like that show up.
right. And if I'm not mistaken, are the cities still show closure and post-closure care as, is it in their financial documents as a liability, or does Bavisma have the financial demonstration of its own?
So we are setting aside our own funding for closure, post-closure, pre-post-closure, all of those activities. We also have the funds for the post-closure at Rock Prairie Road.
Mm-hmm.
What the cities provide is the financial assurance mechanism for the state.
Right.
And that's really due to the way that the regs are written. I think it's 37 80 61 or somewhere in there. The corporate financial test for solid waste facilities, the way that it's written, we have a very difficult time as a nonprofit meeting their definition of a corporation that's profitable, because we're set up to be a nonprofit, our revenue never exceeds our operating expense by the ratio that the state would recognize. So the other alternative would be for us to go buy a bond and do that ourselves, but that expense then obviously would be less revenue we can give back to the cities. And it really doesn't cost the cities anything to just show that on their books, when in reality, the money is in the Bavisma account at our bank that's growing to pay for the eventual closure and post-closure. So I would say that's more a function of the way the current rules are written for TCQ than anything else.
Any questions
And
for?
and for the cities provide that, it's really a letter from them that we update every year. So it's a pretty minimal effort once everybody was in agreement that they're willing to do that.
Okay.
This is Risa. So Brian, what you're saying is the cities just have to basically pledge their future taxing ability or authority,
Correct.
but
Because
the actual money to really pay for it is sitting in your account.
That's entirely correct.
And we have a question from Amy Reeder. Amy, you want to go ahead?
Yes, so I apologize for my confusion, but is your salary paid from the city? Are you are you a city employee, and are they like the landfill equipment operators and all city employees? How does that work exactly?
Now, all of our employees, including myself, are employees of the agency. So we are 100% separate financially from the cities. We have our own policies, our own HR, our own salary structure, if you will. So we're completely independent.
So did you start off being a city employee and then like
No, I was the first employee of Bavisma Inc. When we started, all the other employees came over as under a borrowed employee agreement, and we did learn fairly quickly that didn't work well. The way the borrowed employee agreement was supposed to work, the two cities would loan us employees, and we would pay their salary plus some overhead to the cities. And if we had a problem, or if I had an issue with an employee or what they were supposed to do or their job, I was supposed to go to the city manager, who was supposed to go talk to the employee to say, hey, how come you're not showing up at work? And pretty soon that they got to realize very quickly, actually the first one that kind of pushed the limits and said, you know what, the city manager doesn't care if I show up at the landfill or not, even though the executive director says I'm not performing my job. It's pretty low on the city manager's list to get around to talking to the person that didn't show up for work at the landfill. So with that, we did away with the borrowed employee agreement within about a year of our operation. And truthfully, very quickly, most of the employees came over voluntarily on their own. They had a choice of staying with the agency and voluntarily coming over, or going to the city, and if they had a position available at the city. I think we had one employee that chose to stay with the city, and all the other employees joined the agency. And since that time, in 11 years, our total turnover for all reasons, including retirements, we've had a total of 15. So we have very low turnover.
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation.
And I do know that employee situation and some of the financial transparency issues, led to probably one of your worst nightmares in terms of doing something jointly where the cities essentially sued each other before they established the local government corporation. And I think it was those issues that led them to, I would say, a better agreement and a better structure as a local government corporation, essentially set aside from one city versus the other one. That seems to be working much better.
And both cities are now enjoying a much reduced tipping fee compared to what they used to pay. I think if you were to look into that further, you would have found that there were a lot of transfers going out of the solid waste division back to the general fund for various overheads and other reasons that didn't have anything to do with operating a landfill.
Yeah.
So now they get that same benefit, but it's in the form of a reduced tipping fee. So they now have more money available internally to do whatever they'd like with that savings. The difference, if they were to pay our gate rate at 28 versus the 13, each city saves about 1.6 million per year. So that's that money that would have been transferred before.
So it basically for those two cities, the investment has definitely paid off.
Oh, in huge benefit.
Sure.
Right. And I've been listening to your conversation here this morning. I think you did hit some key areas. You're going to need to find a host county and really have their buy-in, almost more than any other entity. But the more parties that are part of your agreement, the more complex it's going to become. We're kind of fortunate here. Bryan and College Station bring in about the same amount of volume each year. So that benefit going back is about equal. I don't know how you'd handle it. Say if one party of the agreement brought in a small fraction compared to other party, they get different benefits of that reduced tipping fee in that case.
It is going to be one of the issues that, and how they share in those benefits.
Right. And then the same thing for us, the buy-in was 50-50. It was equal buy-in from two agencies or two cities.
Yeah. And
if
that made it
different cities of different sizes. I don't know how you handle that.
Yeah. The analogy that's been used sometimes with this group has to do with Dallas area rapid transit, in the fact that they established themselves and gave cities in the region the opportunity to participate, which would require a commitment of some percentage of their sales tax. And those cities that got in early have that service. But, if you did not sign on early in the process and wanted to get in, that becomes a lot more complex. So it's a situation of, distributing those revenues and expenses and risk accordingly, but also, recognizing that there are initial investors that get the benefit. And if you did not participate early on, it's going to be more challenging to be a participant later on.
Right. I think that's some of the same issues North Texas Water District also faces, trying
Right.
to serve different sized communities.
Mm-hmm. But even those, the 5 that they're our primary customers, aren't that much different in size, but this one, that is going to be one of the challenges in this process.
Mike, we have a hand raised from Bart Van Amberg.
Okay.
It's actually Howard. So Brian, I had 2 kind of follow-up questions. I heard you mention something about you guys are actually sending a payment to the county. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little more. And then I know you said that 20% of your revenues are from the residential, and the other 80% is the commercial haulers. Does that commercial component include anything outside of Bryan and College Station, any of the county haulers and stuff like that, or is that only for? Are you guys only open for the city in the incorporated areas?
Yeah, those are great questions. The host fee that we paid at Grimes County is was negotiated as part of the citing the landfill in Grimes County. It was a negotiated host fee, and it's based off of our gate rate. So it's not based off the city rate. It's based off what we charge at the gate for any customer that comes in. And right now that's about 58 cents a ton, I believe. So 58 cents a ton times some 300,000 odd tons per year. That's added up over the course of 10 years now. So it's a pretty nice fee that we pay Grimes County just as a host fee. And host fees are very common in the landfill industry as the way that you kind of make peace with the people when you're citing the landfill up front. And what the landfill industry really came to realize is that host fees are a good thing to pay because when it comes time to expand, you go back to that same entity and say, hey, we've been paying this this host fee. We'd like to renegotiate, even though we don't need to, and we'd actually like to pay you some more money if you guys would just agree to our expansion. And once they've been enjoying that revenue stream and they've realized that the alternative is no money at all once the landfill closes, a lot of times those counties will say, this is not a bad thing at all. And in fact, now that the landfill is open, we really don't get a lot of complaints or anything else from the landfill or the community around it. So like I said, a lot of people don't want a landfill before it's there, but once it's there, you often see landfills that actually have neighbors that move in closer and closer. And that's certainly the case with most of the existing landfills that y'all are talking about here today. I think Arlington, they put up a huge development right across the main gate from the Arlington landfill that certainly was not there when the landfill started. Your other question, where does the rest of our volume come from? We're open for business. So I always say garbage flows and price dictates direction. So like I said, that $28 a ton, if we ramp that up a few dollars, we would probably chase away some of the volume that's coming from our further reaches. If we lower that gate rate, we would bring in more volume from our further reaches. I would say right now, somewhere between here and Austin is a dividing line, but we go quite a ways closer to Austin than they come to us because the Austin tipping fees are going to be closer to $40 a ton versus our 28. You go over to Brenham, they come up to us instead of down toward Houston. Huntsville used to come to us, but got a lower rate in Leggett landfill, which is a little bit further for them to get to, but that price difference versus the drive time plays into a factor. The other thing that changes the flow of landfill volumes is not just the gate rate, but the price of diesel fuel. So when you see the price of diesel fuel go up, people, the trucking side considers that versus the gate rate. They might pay a higher gate rate if they drive fewer miles. And the opposite is exactly true as well. When the price of diesel starts coming down, those trucks are willing to drive further to get to that lower gate.
Okay. I do want to point out that the host community fee that Brian talked about was extremely instrumental in the fact that when that site was permitted, there was no public hearing and there wasn't one requested, which probably saved a good year and about $1 million in the permitting effort. So definitely was, I think, a good decision by the cities to negotiate that with Grimes County. So, not having to have a public hearing on a landfill that size, taking in that much volume is fairly rare. So,
Right. And we've already purchased the additional property that the county identified in our host fee agreement. So we've grown the site from about 600 acres when we started. We have just over 1,200 acres under our ownership at this time.
okay, I think Dustin had a question about how much that 58,000. I mean, that 58 cents represents what, close to about 175,000 a year.
Yeah, roughly 160 some, 165-ish
Okay.
per year. Again, that goes up as we get more tonnage. We started at about 1,000 tons a day, and we're right now around 1,500. So that's gone up. Even though our gate rate hasn't increased, the amount we're paying to the county has increased.
Yeah, there's some interesting stories about those negotiations that are better left for time. Okay, any other questions? And again, Brian, I appreciate you taking the time. It's real helpful to hear from somebody that's actually operating one of these local government corporations for this group, because it is something that they're going to be determining whether they want to move in that direction, over the next year to try and meet their capacity needs. So thanks again.
It definitely can be done. Again, once the landfill's up and running, it's a terrific way to operate a landfill for a lot of reasons. One of those being that independent budget. So we're not, kind of at the tail end of a city budget or the front end of making money for some stockholders. We can really focus on our operations and our environmental compliance. We've had 10 years of no compliance issues whatsoever, and 10 years of very clean financial audits. So it can be done, and everybody's happy with what we're doing here. So it takes a while to get there. I appreciate it. It's going to be a more complex effort when you have more than two parties that are going to be part of the agreement.
And I'm going to run through these fairly quickly because these are some things that we've talked about in the past, but I thought it was really useful to hear from Brian and what they're doing. Again, we're looking at anywhere from a 10 to 15-year process from site selection, procuring the land, securing the permits, and getting that facility constructed. I was involved in the site selection of the Bovisma landfill, and that took some time, but that was well before social media turned into what it is today in terms of reactions to landfill sites and the opposition. I think we were one of the first sites to have actually a website set up to oppose it, but it was pretty prehistoric given or compared to today's standards. Next slide. Again, we've talked about that. These are the options, you know, in terms of securing that new capacity. You know, it's either a city or a group of cities develop it through some type of interlocal agreement, or a city just does it on their own. The region relies on the private sector to identify and develop a new landfill. This can either be directed through some type of RFP or whatever to get a private firm to build new capacity, or just relying on the private sector, although they have no responsibility at all to do that. They're going to rely on the market conditions and what they feel the return on investment would be. The third option, which I think, you know, we'll spend some meetings with the PAG talking about, is establishing an agency similar to Bavisma to help build that new capacity. And the fourth option is, you know, that nothing gets done. And what that will mean is will have a significant impact on not just Arlington's landfill, but also landfills throughout the COG region, because waste is going to have to more than likely go outside this region. And what that's going to mean is much higher transportation and disposal costs, because you're going to have to haul it longer distances. And as the number of facilities close, the market's going to obviously increase tipping fees because there's the demand for it. So those are the options that are kind of before the cities. Issues related to public ownership. You know, this is definitely something that provides greater control over where that facility is located, what waste is managed, over control over the cost. As you heard from Brian on Bavisma, they're able to do a pretty good job of keeping tipping fees low for their participants, control over the design, and control over the life of that facility by controlling how much waste goes into it. Recognize that with each one of these issues as it relates to control, there are equal and just as significant risk in terms of, you know, being able to identify a site. If you're not able to do that, you know, what does that do to your waste system? So it's just not a matter of these are the benefits, but there are some risks that you'll need to consider as you move forward. And, you know, as Brian mentioned, you know, some of the key elements are there's got to be a shared need, shared economic interest in it. There are definitely economies of scale in doing something that involves more than one city. And, you know, that's kind of shown in terms of Weatherford's composting facility. And the final one is probably one of the more significant ones in terms of this group moving forward, and that is the political will to do something jointly and see the benefits of a cooperative type of program. And some examples, you know, not just the Brazos Valley Solid Waste Management Agency. As he mentioned, North Texas Municipal Water District manages disposal for a number of cities in Collin County. And then there's the option of the Upper Sabine Valley Solid Waste Management Agency, which is, I think, the only agency that was created by the legislature as a way of dealing with this. It's not a local government corporation, but it is a government entity. You have to go through the legislature to do that. And I think it would probably be easier to do it more on the corporation side than on the agency side. So, you know, and we've done the poll earlier, and there is interest in establishing some type of agency, I'm interested in, what the reaction is to Brian's presentation and the potential applicability of that model to this region.
How important is the construction of a new landfill in the western region to you? Okay, so about 56% say it's very important, and then 22% each for fairly important or important.
Robert Smouse was gonna help us through the conversation on citizen convenience stations. And given the time that we've got left, I would suggest that, if we're going to have a next PAG meeting, that he be available to talk about that issue and how we can move forward in terms of that issue. So I'd almost suggest using the remainder of our time to talk about what this group wants to do next, moving forward, instead of spending the time on the citizen convenience station part of it. What are your thoughts?
Hey, Mike, I agree. I think because we have about 15 minutes left, and I think it would be great because that's actually where my head was going as we've been listening to this conversation and watching things flow along was kind of regrouping, connecting with everybody at the end and talking about concrete next steps that we at COGSN can be doing. So if we want to do that and then save the citizen collection station for the next PAG meeting, I think that's a great idea.
Okay. Do you want to, Cassidy, you've been managing this and had an opportunity to, hear what we've talked about today, and, with the other presentations and so forth. What are your thoughts about moving forward?
Well, first, my disclaimer is, please don't be shy, anybody on the line as far as disagreeing with me, but my initial thought, so let me back up a second. I think that first, like you mentioned, probably the next step is taking this to the RCC, which has already been scheduled. You mentioned it earlier that we'll be taking the study and an overview of it and the results and alternatives to the RCC and their meeting in August. And so I think that's the first immediate next step, and also collecting feedback from RCC members as well. But then what I was thinking that probably the next step would be is to convene the project advisory, the policy advisory group again. And then I think personally, I feel like what makes the most sense is convening them to start talking about formalization, to start talking about memberships and bylaws, and get their feedback and information and what COG can do. Edith, feel free to step in if this doesn't sound good, but what COG staff can do is we can work on getting a meeting scheduled, getting some people to the table, and then also providing some options for some bylaws that we have for several of our other committees. I know things will look a little bit different, but we can bring some different options to the table to start moving forward to formalize that group. Because as you said, to kind of work towards implementing these actions items and these next steps, having a formal group and membership established, and I don't think the bylaws need to be incredibly extensive, but having some sort of membership in place that then allows for votes. To me, those were my thoughts as far as the immediate next steps. And then another thing that I had heard, and I'm sorry, and then I will kind of stop chatting here and allow for some feedback, but one of the other things that I did hear, obviously we need to get buy-in and participation, but I think that is kind of a later step, but working on awareness to let others know the issues at hand, like that seemed to come up a couple of times earlier on in the meeting, because what I heard was that some of the smaller communities might not even be aware that we're facing this waste capacity issue. And so I think maybe getting awareness spread and getting their input and buy-in and participation on the PHE would be a good plan too.
Edith, did you want to follow up on that at all, or?
No, I think Cassidy did a great job of summarizing.
Okay. Any other thoughts in terms of next steps? In terms of interest in, meeting, I know this is what, the end of July. August, we're making our presentation to the RCC. I don't know how to do this easily, but a schedule of every 2 months meeting to talk about these issues and getting the PAG formalized is a every 2 month or every month schedule. What does the group think makes the most sense in terms of timing?
Michael, real quick, I see Howard has his hand up.
Well, this time it is Bart Van Amberg. So I'm the Public Works Director here, and I've been informed through Howard of the effort of this group. But, I would certainly comment that, my position or my level here in Mansfield is about the extent. We've been trying to inform upper levels of management, but that's what I see as a real challenge is, getting much interest above the level of people directly involved in solid waste management. I don't know that it's real critical initially unless we want the PAG to be made up of higher level people, but maybe it's more appropriate for the membership of the PAG to be more, solid waste professionals, or at least close to it. So that's a real discussion point, is what's the appropriate membership for the PAG? It's going to be incredibly critical when we start talking about forming an agency, and maybe that's still several years in the future. I don't know. But to get there, I think we need a very good formal roadshow, presentation, informational plan that can be used either by city employees to educate their elected officials, or COG, or a combination of the two. So I certainly think one of the initial steps would be to, start creating an excellent educational program that can be used in order to get that kind of buy-in. I've been really interested to hear about the necessity of getting the county participation, and maybe county participation on the PAG is important. But that's been real interesting to me, is learning how critical county buy-in is, and how they can actually, benefit monetarily from a site.
Would it be appropriate to set the next meeting for end of August, September timeframe? And, I think the two items that I would recommend would be, follow up on the citizen convenience station, because there is interest there, but also a discussion about the agency and how that process at least gets started. Because as he mentioned, it is going to be several years to get that formalized, and determining what its responsibilities are. So I think that discussion is going to be ongoing throughout this process. But there are some unique opportunities, such as citizen convenience stations, where there are some possible collective projects that could be implemented.
Mike, I don't want to step on anybody else who is going to say something, but I'll just jump in here. I do think that maybe let's look at September. We have a lot going on in August, and also just to give us time to get, things scheduled and get it promoted, to make sure that we can ensure that people's schedules, because I know they fill it pretty quickly. So I would say probably we would want to look at least 4 to 6 weeks out from now, so we can start preparing for that in the background. And then going back to your question about meeting frequency, I was thinking that that might be a question that we pose to the PAG in the next meeting when we talk about formalization and bylaws. And there's a couple of different options that we could have. Initially, the formalization process will probably not be done in one meeting. There will be some back and forth and efforts to kind of hammer out bylaws and decide which path to take. And so we could either form a task force and meet with them more frequently, or the PAG might elect to meet as a whole more frequently at first and then move to quarterly meetings or something like that. So, but I think that that would be a good question to pose to the group of people that would be participating to see what their thoughts are. And then, like you said, probably have a component of that meeting covering discussions about formalizing and formulating an agency. And then also that discussion about citizen convenience stations.
Any thoughts from the group in terms of frequency, Amy?
I have kind of a different question. What are your thoughts on the participation in the PAG as far as the eastern counties go? I know Denton's not technically Western County. We're definitely affected because the waste has to go somewhere, like we've talked about. So do you anticipate including anyone in the eastern counties in the PAG?
I think that's definitely, that's one of the issues that that group will have to discuss, especially as it starts formalizing bylaws. I know that if anything is going to be done, through the COG, those meetings have to be open, correct, Cassidy? So any meeting that's sponsored there is going to be open up to anybody that wants to attend. In terms of decision-making, that's where it gets that's where the bylaws come into play, which haven't been established yet.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought process too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just to let everybody know, I think, what is it, end of July, that our contract expires. We'll be making the presentation to the RCC, but I've had the conversations with Edith and Cassidy that, I'm very invested in this program, and, whatever I can do moving forward to keep it moving and assist in, helping set up meetings or providing some input on bylaws, I'm more than happy to do, because I do think this is an important issue, and there's some great opportunities in the future for the region. And let me see, Melinda, you had one more poll. You want to run through that one real quick?
Yep, it's an easy one. Did this workshop help you gain a better understanding of solid waste disposal capacity issues in the Western region?
And if anybody has any questions on, what we've got in the reports, any of the issues that we talked about before, feel free to give me a call, send me an email. There's the contact information. Be more than happy to talk to you about how we can make this successful. Thanks. Thank you, Edith, for giving us the opportunity to work on this. Cassidy, appreciated working with you over the year in putting this together.
Thank you, Mike. It has been a journey, hasn't it?
Yes.
I think we've got some good results. And so we look forward to presenting this information to the RCC, and we look forward to continuing the efforts with the PAG as well and keep the momentum flowing. So, and thank you, Rachel and Mike, for your efforts on this. I know it's a lot of stuff, a lot of numbers to crunch, and there's Rachel. So, and thank you everybody for participating today and ongoing participation in the future.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Everybody.
Appreciate it.